quite distinguished in the field of the study of antibody genes, and he's published a number of papers on evolution and the immune system. He's quite involved in public science education. He works for the National Institute of Public Health and the Federal Drug Administration. Although he works for the government, he's not here representing the government, but he's studied evolution for decades, and he has debated Dr. Gish on some other occasions, and he represents that side. And I want to say to him, thank you so much for coming. You're so gracious. We've never been able to have anybody represent the evolutionist side in a debate, and we've offered a number of times, and he's been so gracious to come, and we thank you for that. Yes. Thank you. And Dr. Dwayne Gish has a PhD in biochemistry from the University of California, Berkeley. He worked for the Upjohn Pharmaceutical Company, has a number of patents. He's probably the foremost authority in the world from the creationist position on the fossil record. He's written a number of bestseller books, including Evolution, The Fossil Record Still Says No, Dinosaurs by Design, The Amazing Story of Creation. He's published in a number of literature and journals. He's debated evolutionists over 350 times. And so we're just glad that he's come tonight to do this. And let's give him a hand, shall we? Okay. And so you'll see some of the section here. And thanks again for coming. We'll let the debate commence.
Good evening. I'd like to begin by thanking Pastor Swift for inviting me to come here tonight to discuss the scientific evidence for evolution. Now, a naive person might wonder why a church pastor would be interested in sponsoring a talk about scientific evidence, but the reason, of course, is that the evidence for evolution suggests a history of life that contradicts certain literal interpretations of the Bible. And that presents an uncomfortable challenge to the religious faith for some folks. Many religious people concerned by this conflict are very happy to hear that there is a solution. Creation scientists claim to have scientific evidence that supports the literal interpretation of the Bible and refutes evolution. Now, some people are so happy to hear this solution, they might not stop to consider whether the creation scientists' answer might in fact be mistaken. So I think it's especially admirable that a group that favors creationism would want to investigate this possibility by arranging a debate to hear both sides. Now, tonight I won't be claiming that evolution is a fact and that everyone must accept it. All I'm going to do is do my best to present what I see as some good evidence for evolution and to show why I think certain creation science arguments are erroneous. And then it'll be up to you to make your own judgments. To begin, I'd like to discuss some different meanings of the word evolution and to make it clear that for some of these meanings, Dr. Gish and I agree about whether they are or are not supported by scientific evidence. And this should help us focus on two areas where we definitely disagree. Okay, first, I think we both agree that the evidence is good for what the creationists call microevolution. As an example, let's consider Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands. These islands didn't exist until relatively recently in Earth's history, as volcanic mountains rose from the sea. When Darwin visited the islands, he found 14 species of finch, with different appearance and feeding habits, and none of these species has ever been found anywhere else in the world. But all the Galapagos finches look similar to a particular seed-eating ground finch found on the nearest mainland. And Darwin reasoned that this mainland species originally colonized the islands after they were formed. Initially, there would have been no competitors for the seed eaters, so the finches must have multiplied rapidly until they exhausted the supply of the best seeds. And then a competition for food began. Because of various mutations in genes governing the development of the beaks in these birds, beak sizes would vary from individual to individual. Some finches with larger beaks could eat tougher seeds that would have been inedible for most of the population, while others with beaks that were thin enough to probe into crevices could get at insects for food. Birds with these favorable traits would be more successful in exploiting the shrinking food supply and would pass on their favorable genes to the next generation. Thus, with continuing mutation and natural selection, the population could have split into groups with different sized beaks or other specializations for different food sources. This is known as adaptive radiation. Now, creationists agree that such changes can occur to produce minor changes in closely related species or microevolution. Now, evolutionists say that identical mechanisms can generate species quite different from each other, but creationists oppose this idea, which they call macroevolution. Darwin's reasoning was that if adaptive radiation created separate finch species in the short time since the first finches colonized the Galapagos, much greater changes might have occurred over the much longer time since the origin of the Earth, which is 4.5 billion years according to current estimates in the professional science literature. This slide shows how a primitive mammal that could have, shows a primitive mammal in the center that could have evolved into the mammals we know today by adaptive radiation over many millions of years. The idea that all mammals living today evolved from a primitive mammalian ancestor is known by evolutionists as common descent. It's rejected by creationists, but it is completely accepted by the scientific community as reflected in the professional science journals. And later, I'll explain why. Now, an independent issue that is somewhat controversial among professional evolutionary scientists is the question of what mechanisms bring about evolutionary change. Most scientists accept the idea that random mutations and selection can account for the evolutionary change that, as Darwin thought. But some papers in the professional literature suggest other mechanisms participate as well. Creationists from Dr. Gish's Institute for Creation Research, or ICR, reject both common descent and the idea that random mutation and natural selection could bring about significant evolutionary adaptations. But I will argue that the ICR arguments are wrong. Finally, there are two other ideas that are often associated with the word evolution, but we both agree are not well grounded in scientific evidence. The first is the idea that the origin of life came about solely through naturalistic processes. We have almost no scientific evidence about the origin of life, so I'll not discuss this idea tonight. Second is the idea put forward by some evolutionists that because naturalistic principles can explain the evolution of life from primitive single-cell species, therefore, evolution disproves a role for God in species origins. This is a conclusion that I vigorously oppose, and I need to discuss it briefly to clarify my position. I believe, and I'm sure Dr. Gish would agree with me, that there is no scientific evidence that rules out a role for God in the origin of species. Similarly, we can't rule out a role for an all-powerful and pervasive God in human disease, in rainbows, or in the orbits of the planets. Now, to elaborate on this last point, it's unfortunately true that some atheists use evolution as a springboard for their anti-religious views. Such arguments are not part of the professional scientific literature and certainly have no place in the scientific classroom, as I'm sure Dr. Gish agrees. But I think you have to be careful to distinguish between atheistic interpretations about evolution, which I agree are comparable to a kind of religion, and the scientific conclusions about evolution, which have nothing to do with religion. Many creationists claim that there is no distinction and that evolution is intrinsically an atheistic idea, and that evolutionists are simply trying to use science classrooms to promote atheism and destroy faith in God. Let me say absolutely that when I discuss the evidence for evolution, I'm not trying to destroy anyone's faith. My own personal religious beliefs are private, but I'd like to tell you that in fact I send my children to a religious school where they study Bible every day. And I'm personally offended when creationists claim that evolutionists are simply trying to destroy religion. So when I argue against Dr. Gish on our 2 points of disagreement tonight, I oppose creation science not because I'm against religion, but because I'm against the bad science that's put forth in the name of creation science. I hope to detach your religious faith from any reliance on the erroneous arguments offered by Dr. Gish and the ICR, since, in my opinion, people who try to shore up their faith using the ICR brand of so-called creation science are deluding themselves. In fact, I hope to show you tonight that what the ICR calls creation science is actually non-professional science. Arguments that aren't good enough to put forward in professional science journals, but are nonetheless presented to non-professional audiences in the hope that creationists might make philosophical and political headway where they have failed scientifically. Indeed, creationist arguments often do persuade audiences who lack the technical training to critically evaluate them. But to the professional science community, the ICR arguments make no more sense than claims that the earth is flat or snake oil can cure cancer. Now, when I've said that in the past, some people have told me that I sound elitist. But when I see how poorly American students perform on science tests compared with students of other countries, I see a need for higher standards in science education, which I guess some people may call elitist. Now, when I say that creation science is non-professional, I certainly don't mean that there are no legitimate or professional scientists who support creationism. Dr. Gish is, or at least was 30 years ago, a professional biochemist. But it's possible for a professional scientist to carry out non-professional science. For example, a fully professional chemist can be an amateur or non-professional astronomer. The critical distinction between professional science and non-professional science is not the academic degrees held by the proponents. Rather, it is that professional science is published in the professional peer-reviewed literature. Non-professional science is not. Now, this distinction is important because creationists would like you to believe that evolution versus creation is being hotly debated in the scientific community. But the fact is, and Dr. Gish would have to agree, there are literally thousands of papers supporting evolution in the professional peer-reviewed scientific literature, but not a single one directly supporting creationism. Though, of course, I'm not considering articles written for creationist publications. Thus, evolution by common descent is completely accepted in the professional science literature. Details about the mechanism are still being debated, but creationists exaggerate these disagreements to falsely suggest that evolution itself is being questioned. Now, I know Dr. Gish will try to convince you that the only reason creationists don't publish their views in the professional scientific journals is that these journals reject creationism out of prejudice. So I'm going to spend a lot of my time tonight showing you with many examples that creation science arguments just don't meet the minimal standards of scholarship for a scientific article. And their poor scholarship can fully explain why they can never publish in the professional scientific literature. Well, why is publication in the professional science literature important anyway? Here's an example that shows one reason. In a debate broadcast over PBS, Dr. Gish claimed, if you look at certain proteins, you'll find that man is more closely related to a bullfrog than he is to a chimpanzee. Now, results like this certainly contradict a prediction of evolution, and many listeners hearing Dr. Gish probably concluded that he had presented a valid argument against evolution. Later, though, Dr. Gish was challenged to come up with the actual data about bullfrog proteins. He couldn't identify the source of the data, but continued to use the argument in debates. Well, it turns out there are no data to support his claim. Finally, after being hounded at a debate by calls of bullfrog, bullfrog, Dr. Gish stopped using the argument, and he admitted in this book that he got the idea about bullfrog proteins by misinterpreting a joke someone made at a talk instead of from actual published data. Unfortunately, such bullfrog scholarship is typical of creationist arguments. Namely, they may sound very convincing to debate audiences, but Dr. Gish would never be able to publish such a ridiculous argument in a professional science journal. Why not? Because in order to publish, he would have to provide a reference to the journal article where the original data was published. No reference, no publication. Scientific journals are certainly not perfect, but they can filter out a lot of bullfrog-type arguments that sound great at debates, but don't meet the standards of professional science and have no place in public school science classrooms. Now, since creationist versus evolutionist scholarship is at the heart of our debate, I'll be looking at two major creationist arguments so you can decide for yourself whether scientists reject them as a result of an elite conspiracy or because of poor creationist scholarship. First, I'd like to address the ICR claim that evolution violates a fundamental law of physical chemistry, the second law of thermodynamics. Let's look at this bogus argument. Thermodynamics literally means the study of the movement of heat. According to the first law of thermodynamics, in an isolated system, the total energy must stay constant. But while some energy is organized in a way that it can be harnessed to perform useful work, other energy can be disordered so that it is useless and cannot be harnessed. A simplified, intuitive version of the second law of thermodynamics says that in spontaneous processes, isolated systems tend to proceed in the direction of increasing disorder, or increasing ratio of useless versus useful energy. Entropy is a scientific way of quantitating the disorder of the energy. So the second law says that the total entropy tends to increase in spontaneous processes happening in an isolated system. Let's look at an example of how the first and second laws apply to an everyday system. If you put an Energizer bunny in a closed insulated box and let him beat his drums, eventually even his batteries will run out. Now the first law says that the total energy in this system has remained constant, yet we know that our bunny has stopped. What's happened to his energy? Well, in fact, it's gone into raising the temperature inside the box by a small amount. This heat energy is disordered and useless, so we say that the entropy, or the disorder and uselessness of the energy, has increased in accordance with the second law, even though the total energy has remained constant in accordance with the first law. Now, let's see how the creationists abuse the second law. The development of life from simple one-celled creatures represents a tremendous increase in order, say the creationists. An increase in order is the reverse of the direction seen in spontaneous processes according to the second law. So the evolution of life from primitive organisms cannot have occurred by natural processes suggested by the evolution model. This argument convinces many people, but I'm going to show you why it is purely bogus, non-professional science. Its mistake boils down to forgetting the fact that localized regions of order can occur in spontaneous processes without violating the second law. As an illustration of this principle, suppose we have an insulated box containing water at freezing temperature, that is 0 degrees centigrade, and we suspend in it a copper ball cooled to minus 10 degrees below freezing. What happens? Well, the water at 0 degrees will gradually warm up the copper ball from minus 10 to 0 degrees, and in the process, a layer of ice will form around the outside of the ball. Now, it's important to note that in this spontaneous process, in accordance with the second law, the entropy of the entire system can be calculated and shown to increase as the ball reaches the same temperature as the water. However, on the surface of the ball, the water molecules that are converted to ice do become more ordered. But this doesn't violate the second law because, as you may remember, localized regions of increased order can occur in spontaneous processes without violating the second law. Now let's explore what happens if we focus only on the crystallization of ice on the surface of the copper ball and ignore the rest of the system. Suppose we could miniaturize a scientist and send him into our container to observe the ice forming. Suppose he radios back to us, "Gosh, there's ice forming here on the surface of this sphere. Gosh, the water molecules are aligning themselves in ordered crystals. Gosh, this increase in order violates the second law of thermodynamics. There must be something supernatural here, and I'm going to broadcast it to the world." Now, we might radio back to him, and let's call him Dr. Gosh, because he's so excitable. Dr. Gosh, before you broadcast about the supernatural, maybe you ought to look at the thermodynamics of the whole system. After all, remember, localized regions of increased order can occur in spontaneous processes without violating the second law. Now, in Dr. Gish's rebuttal to this section of my earlier debate, he kept asking, what does the freezing of ice have to do with evolution? And in his write-up of the debate, he shows that he completely misunderstood the example. He thought that the copper ball model represented an evasion of the second law, when instead the whole point is that the freezing is completely consistent with the second law. So here's the answer to Dr. Gish's question. The copper ball model resembles evolution in that both can be considered localized increases in order, which are not violated by the second law. By examining the error in Dr. Gosh's logic about the shell of ice on the copper ball, we can see clearly how Dr. Gish makes exactly the same error about entropy and the evolution of life in the thin shell of life, the biosphere, that covers the surface of the Earth. Dr. Gosh looks only at the ice on the surface of the sphere and ignores changes elsewhere in the system. So he sees what he thinks is a violation of the second law. Water is becoming more ordered as it freezes, and entropy is decreasing. But if we look at what Dr. Gosh has ignored, the flow of energy that occurs across the surface of the sphere, and the entropy changes beyond the sphere, then we recognize correctly that the entropy of the whole system has increased, and there is no violation of the second law. This shows that Dr. Gosh's analysis was totally wrong. In focusing only on the thin shell of ice at the surface of the copper ball, he's been misled into seeing a non-existent violation of the second law. Similarly, in considering the appearance of life in the biosphere, the thin, life-containing shell on the surface of the Earth, Dr. Gish thinks that within the biosphere, the order has increased, which may well be true. The entropy has decreased. But his conclusion that the second law was violated is totally invalid because he has ignored energy flows across the biosphere and entropy changes outside the biosphere. These energy flows are not small. The sun is more than 1 million times larger than the Earth, and it is a gigantic ball of thermonuclear fusion pouring vast amounts of disordered, unharnessed energy into the solar system. A gigantic increase in entropy, while the relatively tiny Earth, shown to scale in this NASA composite picture, has minimal internal energy. Leaving the sun out of your thermodynamics analysis of the biosphere is like doing an analysis of an automobile while ignoring the existence of the engine. You can derive some amazing arguments for cars driving by supernatural forces if you ignore the engine. If you admit that the thermodynamics of the Earth owes something to the sun, you must include the sun in your analysis. Dr. Gish hasn't. Now notice that I'm not saying two things that Dr. Gish likes to blur and confuse with what I am saying. First, I am not arguing here that the evolution of life occurred by natural processes without divine intervention. Secondly, I'm not even arguing that the evolution of life is consistent with the second law. I wouldn't even know how to go about calculating entropy changes associated with the evolution of life. All I am saying is this, that Dr. Gish has not provided any scientifically valid support that evolution violates the second law because he has not demonstrated that evolution would be associated with a net decrease in entropy if the huge increase in entropy outside the biosphere were considered. As it now stands, Dr. Gish's argument would be rejected by any professional scientific journal, not because of the editors belong to an elite conspiracy against creationism, but because the argument is totally incomplete and invalid, as I hope you can see. I'd now like to turn to another argument of Dr. Gish and show why I think it is false. One favorite tactic of creationists is to misrepresent evolutionary theory. They claim that evolution makes a particular prediction, and then show that the prediction is falsified. The audience easily sees that the prediction is false, but often doesn't recognize that the claimed prediction is not actually predicted by evolution and only by the creationist distorted version of evolution. Creationists describe a false straw man only to demolish it, trying to fool audiences that they have demolished evolution. One example of the ICR straw man concerns the structure of proteins. Proteins are large molecules made of smaller subunits known as amino acids strung together on a long chain. There are 20 different kinds of amino acids, and their exact sequence determines how a protein will fold up and what properties it will have. A typical protein, like the oxygen-carrying globin molecule, has 141 amino acids in a precise sequence. But the number of 141 amino acid long sequences is 20 to the 141st power, a number larger than the number of atoms in the universe. So, says the ICR, it is inconceivable that the correct sequence could have been selected from a random assortment of possible sequences. This persuades many lay audiences that evolution could not have produced a complex protein like globin. But to draw conclusions about the feasibility of evolution from this calculation is totally invalid. This ICR argument, which appears on the sheet that Dr. Gish handed out today, considers the probability of selecting a specific sequence in a single step from the universe of possible random sequences. This probability is a straw man. It has nothing to do with the concept of evolution, which postulates multiple selection steps involving small changes with small improvements. Remember, in this debate, we are not talking about how the first protein sequences arose during the origin of life, but about evolution from primitive one-celled organisms to complex species. So the appropriate question is, if a primitive organism had a protein that performed one function, and that protein had by chance some minimal ability to perform a second unrelated function, how likely would it be to evolve by natural processes like random mutations and selection a new protein able to perform the second function efficiently? Creationists say this couldn't happen. Indeed, Dr. Gish is fond of claiming that random mutations of a well-functioning gene are likely to be detrimental and cannot possibly lead to an improvement in function. But published scientific arguments directly contradict him, and two references are presented there. Similarly, other creationists with a background in information theory argue that random processes cannot generate new information. Of course, they forget that we are not postulating only random processes, but rather multiple cycles of random mutation followed by selection for the gene encoding a protein with improved function. The new information gained by the new efficiently functioning protein derives from the selection system, not just from random mutation. Well, I'd now like to describe to you a biological model that proves that random mutation and selection can in fact lead to improved function, a model that directly refutes this creationist claim. When an animal or a human is immunized with a foreign substance or antigen, the body makes specific proteins that are capable of binding to the foreign antigen. These are called antibodies, what I study, and are important when the antigen is an invasive bacterium or a virus because the antibodies help fight off the infection. If one draws blood at different times after the immunization, one finds an interesting effect. Over several weeks, the efficiency of the antibody in binding the antigen, which is called the antibody affinity, gets better and better. Antibodies bind tighter and tighter to the antigen. How is this to be explained? It turns out that antibodies are made by a kind of white blood cell known as B lymphocytes. Each particular lymphocyte makes only one type of antibody against a specific antigen. This picture shows 3 lymphocytes, each displaying on its surface the particular antibody it can make. When these cells encounter an antigen, the antigen can stimulate only one lymphocyte, the one whose antibody can recognize and bind to the antigen. The other cells are unaffected. The stimulated cell divides into many daughter cells, which then go on to secrete their antigen-binding antibody molecules into the blood. The efficiency of binding increases after a week because at about that time, the activated lymphocytes turn on a hypermutation mechanism that targets their antibody genes, and just those genes, for random mutations. Most of the mutations have no effect on the ability of the antibody protein to bind antigen. And when a mutation does have an effect, it usually decreases the efficiency of binding. But occasionally, a random mutation leads to an increase in binding affinity. Cells with such favorable mutations make antibodies that are better able to compete to bind antigen. And so these cells continue to receive the stimulus to divide and secrete their high affinity antibody. The cells making lower affinity antibodies get less stimulation and eventually die. The survival of only those B cells making high affinity antibody explains why the average antibody affinity rises after immunization. So antibody gene mutation and selection is a sort of mini evolution of improved function based on random mutation and selection that occurs regularly in all of us. This example shows clearly that the ICR is wrong when they claim that random mutation is always detrimental and cannot lead to improved fitness. Furthermore, it's instructive to consider the way Dr. Gish has tried to rebut this argument when I presented it at earlier debates, because his rebuttal strategies say a lot about his standards of scholarship and about whether creationist arguments are rejected fairly out of prejudice. Dr. Gish questioned the validity of mutations in the first place, saying that it was controversial, and he was surprised that Dr. Max, with an MD and PhD, could believe it. But when I challenged Dr. Gish on this, he could not name a single article opposing the idea of mutation of antibody genes, which doesn't surprise me because I've worked in my laboratory for 20 years on antibody genes, and I've seen hundreds of papers supporting it and not a single one opposing it. The claim that it is controversial is another bullfrog argument, a smear of antibody mutation dreamed up by Dr. Gish when he couldn't find a valid way to respond to my example. So in this section of our debate, I've described to you two favored creationist arguments, that evolution would violate thermodynamics, and that random mutations can't lead to improvements. And I've shown you that both arguments are scientifically invalid. The thermodynamics argument is based on a grossly incomplete analysis, and the claim that random mutation and selection cannot lead to improvements is refuted by mini-evolution of antibody genes. And what creationists have said about both of these arguments reveals their poor standards of scholarship and explain why their arguments are non-professional and therefore are inappropriate for professional scientific publications or for public science classrooms. Thank you.
There we go. All right. All right. My pleasure to be here this evening, ladies and gentlemen, and have this opportunity to defend the creationist position. Now, I want to make very clear immediately what we are suggesting, or what we are going to do, is to compare a theistic, supernatural, spatial creation versus a non-theistic, mechanistic, materialistic theory of evolution. Now, all evolutionists are not atheists, but I assure you the theory of evolution that is being taught in our schools and our universities today is an atheistic theory. God is not involved. God's not necessary. From the start of the Big Bang to the present day, everything happened naturally. Darwin himself said if you had to invoke God at any place, his theory was absolutely worthless. So regardless of what Dr. Max has said, what is being taught to our children is atheism. It's an atheistic theory. And as a matter of fact, evolutionists say repeatedly, creation is religion, evolution is science. We got to keep creation out of the schools because that's religion, while evolution is science. Well, first of all, I want to document the fact that evolution itself is a religion. Well, something's not working here. I want to see that next slide. Thank you. Well, yeah, well, let's see what we get from here. What do we read here? Now, this is by Julian Huxley and Jacob Bronowski, two very famous evolutionists. And they say that a religion is essentially an attitude to the world as a whole. Thus, evolution, for example, may prove as powerful a principle to coordinate man's beliefs and hope as God was in the past. Now, if that's not religion, I don't know what is. Now, furthermore, there's a famous philosopher of science, Dr. Michael Ruse, who in the trial in Arkansas back in 1981 got on the stand and said, evolution is science, creation is religion. And the judge then, using that advice, he declared the equal time law unconstitutional. Well, Dr. Michael Ruse has revealed the fact that after this trial, now he was a famous philosopher of science, quoted all over the world for these statements and so forth, written many books, of which I have several in my own library, a Darwinian evolutionist today, just as he was then. But he spent 20 years studying this question of evolution and religion. He published an article in the Canadian newspaper, May 13th in the year 2000, published in Toronto, in which he had revealed that after this 20 years of research, he had changed his mind. Let's see what he says today. He said that evolution is promoted by its practitioners as more than mere science. Evolution is promulgated as an ideology, a secular religion, a full-fledged alternative to Christianity with meaning and moralities. A line or two later, he says, evolution is a religion. Now, regardless of what Dr. Max is telling you tonight, that is what is being taught to our children. It's a humanistic, non-theistic religion. That is the unofficial state-sanctioned religion in our schools today. Now, not all schools, not all classrooms. There's many Christian teachers who actually teach creation and so forth. But that is doctrinaire today. And don't let anybody kid you. This is what is being taught to our children. Now, let's see. I'm going to refute some of the things that he said in my rebuttal, but I want to cover the material that we're supposed to be covering in these first two subjects. Now, I just want to point out he's established a system, started with a system, and then started to discuss it. He didn't discuss the origin of these systems. He avoided that. How did these systems come about? He didn't really get down to the truth of the matter, as a matter of fact. Well, let's see. Evolution and the science of thermodynamics. What has scientific research established? Well, let's see. Here's the theory, the Big Bang theory. The only products of this Big Bang, of this hypothetical Big Bang, supposedly happened some billions of years ago. Started with some cosmic egg of some kind. Nobody knows where it came from or how it got there. Someone suggested perhaps the cosmic chicken laid the cosmic egg. But the thing blew up, and out of that Big Bang, only two things were created, hydrogen and helium, mostly hydrogen gas. Now, everything in this universe, your human brain, everything in this auditorium tonight, everything in this entire universe, ultimately came from hydrogen gas. We went from hydrogen gas to people, according to this theory, and so forth, and we produced the universe like that. Now, these molecules of gas were racing out at enormous speed. And they expanded to the point where the temperature was about 10 degrees above absolute zero, and then had almost a perfect vacuum. Now, these molecules were racing away from each other. And now Dr. Max has already admitted that the second law of thermodynamics applies to an isolated system. An isolated system can go in one direction and one direction only. And so let's see what people have said about this. Now, let me back up here. Now, if evolution is true, if we started with this hydrogen gas and nothing else, then certainly matter must possess this inherent ability to transform itself from disorder to order, from simple to complex. That must be a natural ability of matter. Of course, that must be true. On the other hand, if creation is true, then matter would not possess this ability. But if something has happened since creation to change the initial created state, the matter would have a tendency to run down, to decay. So evolution said things go this way. The creation says things are going to go this way throughout this universe. Now, Dr. Max admitted that the second law of thermodynamics applies to an isolated system. Well, the universe, in their view, is an isolated system, so it would apply to the origin of the universe, obviously. Now, what is scientific research established concerning entropy or thermodynamics? And one evolution said this, that is the idea of evolution. I'm sorry, I'm hitting the wrong button here. The difficulty with the idea, that is, of evolution, of course, is the general natural tendency of all observed systems to go from order to disorder, reflecting dissipation of energy available for future transformation. The law of increasing entropy. That's a law. It's not ever been known to be violated. Things run down. All systems do that. And here's another statement. The second law of thermodynamics says that left to itself, any isolated system will go towards greater entropy, which also means towards greater randomness and greater likelihood. And here is a statement I like by Isaac Asimov. Another way of stating the second law then is the universe is constantly getting more disorderly. Ladies and gentlemen, this universe is running down. Every star is burning up its fuel. That fuel cannot last forever. And if there is no God, or God would not intervene, this universe is going to die someday, because every star will have burned up all of its fuel, then the lights are going to go out. There'll be no life. There'll be no activity whatsoever. Every scientist would acknowledge this is true. Running down this entire universe. And we read further that he says that viewed that way, we can see the second law all about us. We have to work hard to straighten a room, but left to itself, it becomes a mess again. Very quickly and very easily. Even if we never enter it, it becomes musty and dusty and musty. How difficult to maintain houses and machinery on our own bodies in perfect working order. How easy to let them deteriorate. In fact, all we have to do is nothing. And everything deteriorates, collapses, breaks down, wears out, all by itself. And that is what the second law is all about. Ladies and gentlemen, it seems to me if that's what the second law is all about, evolution is in trouble. As a matter of fact, it is impossible. The second law applies without exception to isolated systems. The evolutionists believe our universe is an isolated system. It started in the chaos and disorder of the Big Bang and the simplicity of hydrogen gas, according to evolutionists, and it transformed itself into what we have today. Now, if that is not the violation of the second law of thermodynamics, I don't know what is. Because we have these molecules of gas racing out at an enormous speed, way out there to a perfect vacuum almost, to extremely low temperature, and somehow it created the universe by self-transformation. Now that is certainly a violation of the second law of thermodynamics. And there's certainly, you think about that. You and I came from hydrogen gas, ultimately, according to the evolutionists. As a scientist, I simply say I cannot believe such a thing. It's just unbelievable what an unbeliever must believe in order to be an unbeliever. Now, I assure you, this example that Dr. Max used of the copper ball has absolutely nothing to do with evolution. That's not evolution. That example is totally irrelevant. It forms ice on this ball, so what? Is that evolution? Are you forming a living organism by such a process? Do you know you get water to freeze, you have to take energy out of it. You lower the temperature, and the ice freezes. but you don't have complexity, you have order. But if you had a typewriter, every key you hit said A, B, 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 you'd have a lot of order, but you'd have no complexity. And that's the way with ice. Ice has no complexity. It's dead. It's dead as anything can get. What relevance does this freezing of water have to do with evolution? Has absolutely nothing to do with evolution. Because the formation of proteins, you have to put energy into that system. Tremendous amount of energy. And that's not going to happen spontaneously. No, I tell you what, you have a protein molecule, it runs down, it degenerates. It doesn't form spontaneously. So, what do we conclude? Now, there's no question about it, ladies and gentlemen. Even, the second law even applies to open systems. And I want to say, maybe, I don't know, I should leave this to the rebuttal period. But energy, Dr. Max says, energy coming from the sun, that our Earth is an open system, and indeed it is. And he says the second law doesn't apply to an open system. We've got that energy coming from the sun. Yes, we do. Yes, it is an open system. Is that all you need? Strip the layer of ozone away. You have a layer of ozone surrounding the Earth. Remove it. Would there be a living thing on the face of this earth? I should say not. Bacteria to man would be destroyed. Why? Because that energy come from the sun is not the solution to the problem. It is the problem. Because that ultraviolet light is terribly destructive. It kills things. And on the hypothetical primordial earth, there was no layer of ozone. Evolutionists don't believe there was any ozone because that's oxygen, and oxygen is fatal to any origin of life idea. So there was no oxygen, there's no ozone. And therefore, that deadly, destructive ultraviolet light comes right down to the surface of the earth, and it would destroy anything on this earth. It would not convert simple things to complex things. It would destroy anything that could be complex on the face of the earth. So he has no solution whatsoever to this problem. We could say more, and we will say more, but this second law of thermodynamics is absolutely fatal to this evolution. This universe is not and could not be an isolated system. There has to be something external to the natural universe, independent of the universe, that introduced the complexity, the order, the information that we have, and created the universe. If science is science and natural laws are natural laws, then certainly the universe could not have created itself. So we conclude, as we say here, that evolution certainly violates the second law of thermodynamics. There's no question about it. And I could say much more, and we'll come back to it. The universe is not an isolated system. There is a creator external to that natural universe. What about random mutations in probability? Now, Dr. Max says he didn't want to talk about the origin of life, but then he got into the proteins and so forth, and that's what we do when we're talking about the origin of life. But let's see about this probability. Evolutionists postulated that all variations were produced by mutations. All the genetic differences were produced by mutation. We start with a little single-cell organism billions of years ago. That's all there was on the earth. And he would still be nothing but a little old microscopic organism, but he began to make mistakes. Genetic errors were produced. And evolution would admit almost all these things are bad, and I think they're all bad. But they say almost everyone is bad, but once in a while one just happens to be good, just by chance. And then there's some sort of a selection here. They say mutations are random genetic errors. Thousands of human diseases and crippling conditions are caused by mutations. Evolutionists postulate that very rarely a mutation can be beneficial. They claim that the good mutant reproduces in larger numbers than the original and finally replaces it. This is called natural selection. That's what they have. Mutation, these terrible mutations, these terrible things, they do all these horrible things, and some process they call natural selection. Well, I wonder how probable that process could be. Richard Dawkins, atheist evolutionary biologist, declared that natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind, no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. It is the blind watchmaker. There you have it. These random genetic mistakes by this blind process of natural selection, and that's produced everything we have living on the face of the earth today, according to evolutionists. I guess we could be pardoned for having some question about this process. Now, can random genetic mistakes coupled with a blind, unconscious, automatic process that has no goal, no purpose, create all the incredibly complex plants and animals that now exist and that has ever lived? What would be the odds against this happening just once? Well, let's see. Julian Huxley, a British evolutionary biologist, calculated that without natural selection, the odds of getting a horse by random genetic errors would be 1 chance out of the number 1, followed by 3 million zeros. That would take 3 large books to 500 pages each just to print that number. 1 followed by 3 million zeros. 1 chance out of that number of that happening. But he said it did happen. It's impossible, but it did happen, he said, because of natural selection. All right, now we have something that is impossible. Something else makes it happen. What can take something that we would say is impossible and make it happen? Well, let's see. What would it take to take something that is impossible to make it happen? To be God. Only God can do that. We say with God all things are possible. With God nothing is impossible. The evolutionist says with natural selection all things are possible. With natural selection everything is possible. That's their God. What can take something that is so improbable, it's 1 chance out of the number 1 followed by 3 million zeros, and make it happen? Certainly no natural process could ever do that. Certainly not. And he said he didn't want to talk about the origin of life. Well, here's a protein molecule, 124 amino acids, 20 different kinds. If you calculate the probability of that happening by chance on this earth in 5 billion years, it would never happen. Never happen. If it did happen, you'd only get 1 molecule. The probability of something like that happening is absolutely 0. And before there is no life, there is no natural selection. Natural selection is reproduction, reproduction success. Before life, there is no reproduction. There is no natural selection. The probability that one single protein molecule would arise by chance is absolutely 0. And I'm a biochemist. I've worked with protein. And I know you just don't throw a bunch of amino acids in a flash and wait for them to hook up. They don't hook up. Those things would never hook up to each other because that takes the input of energy. You put that thing in water and it just splits apart. It runs down. I don't blame Dr. Max for not wanting to talk about the origin of life, because they are at absolute 0 when it comes to any theory on the origin of life. And even if you had all these things, you'd never get a living cell, which is so utterly, utterly complex. The idea that life created itself is a fairy tale. It violates what we know in physics and chemistry, ladies and gentlemen. Now let us look at some things that evolutionists say have originated. Dr. Max didn't really talk about any system that exists. He took living systems and tried to defend that. But if evolution is true, you've got to explain how they originated. Let's see if we can do that. What about the metamorphosis, process of metamorphosis? Well, that's a complex process. I'm going to use the example of the monarch butterfly, and I'm going to do this quickly so we can get through it. The monarch butterfly lays eggs, of course, and then out of that we have a caterpillar. It has legs for crawling and mouth parts for eating leaves. That's all it does. Crawls around all day long and eats leaves. It crawls around all day. That's what it does. But after several molts, it reaches the final stage. Now a miraculous process begins. First thing, he makes some sticky stuff, he makes some sticky stuff, and he fastens himself to a stem, goes around in what's called the J shape. Then he makes one last molt. Now he gets rid of his legs, gets rid of his eyes. Now he's blind, can't see. All right. Now a miraculous thing happens. It takes less than 3 minutes to go from this stage to the next stage. He produces a chrysalis. That is an engineering marvel in itself. How could evolution, using not knowing the future, no goal, no purpose, through a bunch of genetic mistakes, and these good mutations are extremely rare, so they're long time in between. They produce only a slight change, and you have to have this struggle of existence and kill off the original, so that'd take a long time. To get all of the new genes to produce that chrysalis, thousands of new genes would be necessary. It would take hundreds of thousands of years, and of course, he's long gone before that. You see, evolution could not do this. It's not, well, we just don't know, we just don't understand now how this could have happened. No, we know how it could not have happened, and it could not have happened by evolutionary theory. Now, in that chrysalis, there's a little heart beating, and the rest of the material looks like green jelly. Now, evolution really has a tough job. How is evolution, based upon these genetic mistakes, going to convert or program that green jelly-like material to become a butterfly? Nobody's ever seen a butterfly. Nobody has the foggiest idea what you need to make a butterfly. But somehow, through these random genetic mistakes, so-called, you produce a butterfly. Well, that chrysalis is not going to hang there for several hundred thousand years waiting for this to happen a little bit at a time. It happens in just a few days. We see the developing butterfly, and after about 8 or 9 or 10 days, it breaks out of that chrysalis, pumps the fluid from its tummy into the wings, and once more, we have the butterfly. Now, I've challenged my evolutionary opponents many times. I've challenged Dr. Max to please tell us how evolutionary process could do this. I've never had a single evolutionist ever explain how that could happen. Never answered my challenge. And at one time in my lecture at UC Davis, University of California at Davis, they asked a professor in the audience to respond. He was an expert on butterflies. That's his life work, butterflies. And he got up and said this: well, we used to believe that the caterpillar came first, then the butterfly came later. Now we believe probably the butterfly came first and the caterpillar came later. But he said we don't have any way to explain that either. Well, if I put him in the audience and told him what to say, he couldn't have done a better job for me. Expert, he had to admit we don't have the foggiest notion how that process could have evolved. The Time Life publication called Insects says metamorphosis is a miraculous process, and we have no idea how it originated. Now, ladies and gentlemen, talk about complexity. Talk about design for a purpose. You know, in intelligent design, we see multiplied examples of intelligent design, things that were designed to accomplish a purpose. And they're so incredibly complex, they never could evolve by any kind of Darwinian evolution. How much time do I have? 5 minutes, okay. I wish you could have heard the talk by Dr. Galuza we had on the human reproductive system, the incredible complexity, and how we see the things that have been designed for a purpose to make this process succeed. It is unbelievable. And then to believe that evolution did that by a series of mistakes is beyond comprehension. Now, there's more. Now, Dr. Max is defending the Darwinian theory of evolution, neo-Darwinism, the idea of the genetic mistakes or mutation followed by this process, so-called of natural selection. That's called neo-Darwinism. More and more evolutionists are beginning to abandon faith in this theory. Now, that's the theory that's taught as a fact. in our schools in California, by edict, is taught as truth, not to be questioned. They don't allow any challenge. No one can bring anything that would cast any doubt on any of these processes. And certainly you cannot say one word about creation. Say this is not religion. It is. And they're teaching our children, you see, about this. And this neo-Darwinism that Dr. Max is defending, what is being taught is true. I mean, it's chiseled in stone. But more and more evolutionists are saying it's wrong. Couldn't possibly have produced what we have by this process of these random genetic mistakes and so forth and so on. Couldn't happen that way. They have some various other ideas. Some of them suggest big jumps in evolution, that a reptile laid an egg and a bird was hatched from the egg. Just like that, we went from a reptile to a bird. That's why we don't find transitional forms in the fossil record. They just didn't exist. Boy, that must have been a tremendous shock to Mama Reptile when that happened. I think she'd given up motherhood. Well, one of these, and there's this, many, I could cite from the scientific literature that I read, more and more of these evolutionists are coming out and rejecting Darwinism. One of those is Dr. Soren Lovetrop, a well-known Swedish scientist. I heard him speak a number of years ago in Jerusalem at Hebrew University. Both he and I had invited to participate in a creation evolution seminar. He was an evolutionist. Both evolutionists and creationists were there. And when I heard him speak, I knew immediately he was not a Darwinian. He said, no way could mutations and natural selection produce what we have today. And he believed in these big jumps. Well, he published a book in 1987. The title of the book was Darwinism, the Refutation of a Myth. In that book, he described Darwinism from the beginning to the present time. He tells us why he rejects that theory, that mechanism. Then he describes his own ideas about evolution. Now, what he calls the Darwinian myth, let me emphasize, is what's being taught in our schools as fact. No challenge permitted. That's what he calls the Darwinian myth. Let's see what his conclusion was concerning this. He said this: I believe that one day the Darwinian myth will be ranked the greatest deceit in the history of science. I want you to think about that. What is being taught in our schools and universities, what is being defended here tonight by Dr. Max, this evolutionist says is the greatest deceit in the history of science. Incredible. I certainly agree with Dr. Lovetrop. But we creationists, we go one step further. We say the very notion of evolution is the greatest deceit in the history of science. Now, we're not saying that these evolutions are deliberately deceitful or dishonest. I'm not saying that by Dr. Max at all. But they have this worldview. You must exclude any possibility of the Creator. If we admit the possibility of a Creator, then we can point out the evidence that supports that. But they say they must exclude that. We will not even consider that possibility. Therefore, they've adopted something that this evolutionist says is the greatest deceit in the history of science. How much time do I have now? 30 seconds. All right. Well, I'm going to come back with a rebuttal to answer some of these things that Dr. Max has said, but I'm running out of time, so I'm going to close right now. And I thank you. Thank you very much.
You want to hit the... Okay. I'd like to try once more to remind Dr. Gish that what ice has to do with evolution is that both ice and evolution represent localized decreases in entropy that are not violations of the second law. If he can remember that, for the next few minutes till his rebuttal, maybe he can explain why he thinks that localized increase cannot occur according to the second law. At my first debate with Dr. Gish, I challenged him to show that his argument is better than non-professional. I arranged to have the journal Creation Evolution invite Dr. Gish to publish a valid technical analysis supporting his claim that the evolution of life violates the second law. Now there can be no false excuses about biased journal editors refusing to publish creationist ideas. It would be a perfect way for Dr. Gish to present his argument to the scientific community if he had an argument beyond the superficial, non-professional science that he spouts at debates. My challenge was published in 1989 in Creation Evolution, but the journal has never received Dr. Gish's response. Apparently, in all this time, Dr. Gish has not been able to put together a scientifically valid analysis supporting his second law argument, and yet in the meantime, he's continued to repeat this non-professional argument in many debates, Back to Genesis seminars, and other talks. I believe that Dr. Gish will never present written details of his argument to an audience that might be able to critically evaluate it. And for the same reason that a cancer quack wouldn't want his snake oil pills subjected to professional scrutiny. Both know that their claims can't stand up to evaluation by professional scientists. Now, in his writings in earlier debates, Dr. Gish used to stress that the second law was contradicted by increasing complexity of life in the biosphere. But recently, he's also been talking about the complexities of the universe, as you heard tonight, which he claims violate the second law's prediction of increasing disorder. In this newer claim, Dr. Gish makes exactly the same mistake, ignoring the tremendous increase in disordered energy due to the flux of radiation from the stars. In business accounting, to determine your profit, you have to calculate your total gross income, but then you have to subtract your total expenses. When Dr. Gish looks only at factors that show increasing order to support his claim that there's been an overall net increase in order in the universe, or a net decrease in entropy, that's like claiming you have a profit by looking only at your gross income and ignoring your expenses. Dr. Gish is trying to introduce Enron accounting into thermodynamics by considering only factors that may represent an increase in order and ignoring factors that go the other way. The only valid way for Dr. Gish to prove a net decrease in entropy, as he has claimed, is for him to calculate it quantitatively the sum of the factors that represent increasing entropy and those that represent decreasing entropy, and show that the decrease is larger. But Dr. Gish has not done this, so his claim that evolution violates the second law actually violates the standards of professional scientific scholarship. To see what a real professional expert in thermodynamics thinks of Dr. Gish's argument, I'd like you all to check out the website I've listed there on your handouts, written by Dr. Alan Harvey, a PhD in chemical engineering from Berkeley, specializing in molecular thermodynamics, who, unlike Dr. Gish, is currently active in this field and publishing thermodynamics papers in the professional scientific literature. To whet your appetite, I'll read some of the beginning and end of Dr. Harvey's essay. He writes, "I'm an evangelical Christian. I believe the Bible to be entirely trustworthy in conveying God's messages. Where people get into trouble is when, for example, they take the message of Genesis 1, that God created everything, including us, and try to read it as something is not, a science text. Then he explains many reasons why the creationist second law argument is technically invalid, and here's how he ends his essay. The myth that Christianity is for stupid people is widespread, and part of the blame must rest on some Christians. This harm to our witness will only be overcome if Christians refocus their message and repudiate those arguments, like the misuse of the second law, that are simply incorrect. Many will still reject and belittle Christ and those who follow him. But if the world is going to laugh at us, let it at least be for a central doctrine like the cross or the resurrection, or for our insistence on loving everybody, but not for mistaken pseudoscientific arguments. So it's up to you to decide whether to accept the views of a professional scientist like Dr. Harvey or the arguments of Dr. Gish, who has no expertise in thermodynamics, has never published in the professional literature on thermodynamics, and has not answered the challenge to provide a professional scientific explanation of his argument. Now, Dr. Gish has also claimed that all mutations are harmful. The mini-evolution of antibody genes clearly shows that he's wrong. Dr. Gish has also responded that antibody mutation is so complex it couldn't have arisen by evolution and must have been designed. But the question of whether the antibody system is complex is totally irrelevant to whether the source of improvement in the functioning system is random mutation and selection. Perhaps by emphasizing the complexity of the antibody mutation in mammalian lymphocytes, Dr. Gish is trying to argue that one-celled organisms like bacteria are too simple to generate improved function by this Darwinian mechanism. If that's his point, he is again incorrect. The scientific literature includes many papers describing how progeny of a single bacterial cell can be subjected to different environmental stresses of temperature, pH, or nutrient starvation to see how the bacteria cope. In these experiments, we start with a single copy of each gene in each cell. So the improved fitness that develops in a stressful environment occurs as a result of random mutations occurring during the experiment. In each case, one can show that bacteria surviving after this stress can outcompete the original strain in the new environment. They've become more fit for that environment through mutation and selection. One can compare the relevant genes from the original bacterium and from the final fitter strains to document the mutations. Often, such experimental evolution is found to be speeded up by the addition of chemicals known to increase mutations. Different environmental stress conditions lead reproducibly to different sets of mutations in the surviving populations, exactly as predicted by the model of adaptive radiation discussed earlier. Thus, the creationist claim that no mutations are beneficial has been disproved by many, many experiments in bacteria as well as in mammalian lymphocytes. Indeed, the power of random mutation and selection to yield improvements has been recognized by the biotechnology pharmaceutical industry. For instance, a number of companies are trying to make antibodies that would bind tightly to an antigen specific for a cancer cell and deliver a toxin that would kill the cancer. To find an efficient antibody like this, the most efficient technique has been to take a pool of antibody genes encoding completely random binding sites and engineer them to be expressed on the surface of bacterial viruses, such that each virus expresses copies of a single antibody on its surface, different from the antibody expressed on any other virus. A few viruses are always found that can bind weakly to the cancer antigen. These are collected and allowed to multiply in bacteria under conditions that favor random mutation. A new generation of viruses expressing randomly mutated antibody genes is then grown up and again selected for the strongest binding to the cancer antigen. After multiple rounds of such mutation and selection, the binding properties of the antibody can be improved more than 1,000-fold. So as we speak, the evolutionary principles Dr. Gish says are impossible are actually being applied on a routine basis by biotechnology companies. And incidentally, their motive is not to prove evolution, but to make money. Again, these experiments contradict Dr. Gish's arguments that random mutation and selection cannot lead to increased fitness. Dr. Gish is either out of touch with the literature and hasn't read about these studies, or perhaps he's read them and figures that he can get away with false claims about mutations always being harmful when addressing lay audiences. Obviously, such creationist misrepresentations could never be published in a professional scientific journal because knowledgeable scientists serving as journal editors would reject such a paper. But of course, then the creationists would complain that the reason they were rejected was prejudice against creationism. I'll stop here.
Published in these standard journals because our science is so poor. Let me tell you one thing. You try to publish an article and you have the finest science that anybody could conceive in that article, but you challenge the possibility that evolution may not be true, you are not going to get that article published in any standard journals today. I tell you that by experience. I've had experience. Michael Behe, who wrote the book Darwin's Black Box. Dr. Behe is a biochemist, and really a good one. And he had this book explaining, defending intelligent design, giving many examples of complex systems which could not possibly have evolved by Darwinian evolution. And yet if you lose just one part of it, the whole system is destroyed. It's a great book. And that book was reviewed by people in many of these journals, and they just ran it down. They didn't really try to review it. They just said it just poor science and all that sort of thing. Dr. Behe submitted a response to the scientific journals defending what he had written and giving scientific evidence for it. Not one would publish that article. Not one. The only journal published it was a journal on philosophy. Why wouldn't they publish the response of this outstanding scientist on his outstanding scientific material? Why wouldn't they publish it? Why wouldn't they let the public, let people see it and make up their minds whether Michael Behe had good science or not? They will not publish it. And I've had that experience. I've talked to an editor of one of these journals. I asked her, I said, I'd like to publish. I submitted an article supporting the creation position. Will you publish it? She said, no, we won't. Never seen it, don't have any idea what I would put in it. Don't tell me they don't do that. Yes, they do. Now, he said, I haven't answered this challenge about the second law of thermodynamics. That's right, that's not my field, it's not his either. Dr. David Boylan, who was the dean of the Department of Engineering at Iowa State University, one of our outstanding creation scientists, an expert in thermodynamics, he wrote an article on thermodynamics and submitted it to one of our journals. And we had a book published by the Creation Research Society on the second law of thermodynamics, and I had a chapter in there. We have answered this material. This material has been published. Why should we answer all the things that I have to do and all the time-consuming things I have to do to try to write an article like that when it's already been published? We have published it, and we have answered these things. Now, let's see what evolutionists have to say now. You see, he says all we need is an open system, have that energy coming from the sun. That solves the problem. Well, here's a statement by George Gaylord Simpson and William Beck, two evolutionists, in a book they published some years ago. They said this: the simple expenditure of energy is not sufficient to develop and maintain order. A bull in a china shop performs work, but he neither creates nor maintains organization. The work needed is particular work. It must follow specifications. It requires information on how to proceed. That is an excellent scientific statement. But then these guys would turn around and believe that life evolved on this planet by using a bull in a china shop approach, because that energy coming from the sun is certainly nothing more than a bull in a china shop. Now, here's another statement by Harold Blum. Listen to what he has to say. The temperature of the sun is about 6,000 degrees Kelvin. That of the earth about 285 degrees Kelvin. In other words, the sun's a lot hotter than the earth. Energy flows from the sun to the earth with an accompanying increase in entropy. And a suitable machine can convert into work some of the energy flowing from the sun to the earth. End of quote. What did he say? A suitable machine can do that. But on the hypothetical earth, there were no machines. There were no living plants. There were no green plants with photosynthesis. They're just these simple gases. That's all. But what did he say? If you have that machinery, yes, that can happen. Well, it wouldn't have happened because of the deadly destructive action of the sun. That ultraviolet light's not going to take simple things and make complex things out of it. Not at all. Listen to this, another statement by Harold Blum. How, when no life existed, did substances come into being which today are absolutely essential to living systems, yet which can only be formed by these living systems? Did you get that? Let me read that again. How, when no life existed, did substances come into being which today are absolutely essential for living systems, yet which can only be produced by living systems? In other words, you had to have that right at the start. And this idea that there's no problem with the second law of thermodynamics, this fellow he quoted there at Berkeley, whatever it was, he didn't give any scientific evidence. He didn't say why there's no contradiction with the second law of thermodynamics. He said, Dr. Maxwell, he's an expert. That's his area. Listen, Dr. David Boylan was the dean of the Department of Engineering at Iowa State. He had better know his thermodynamics, and he has written that. Of course, you have a tremendous problem with the second law of thermodynamics and evolution. Now, he mentioned this little radio program. It was about 10 o'clock at night, and they had me come over to this radio station, and I sat in a seminar, and I heard this scientist say that some of the proteins in the blood of the bullfrog were more closely related to the human than that from the chimpanzee. I heard him say it. Now, in all my innocence in this little radio thing at 10 o'clock at night, I mentioned this. I didn't have any documentary evidence for any journal that I had. I heard this scientist say this. He was an evolutionist. And he listen, if he was telling a joke, he certainly wasn't smiling when he told that. He wasn't laughing at all. He was making fun of evolutionists, what he was doing, and he was an evolutionist on their dating systems. And he said it in all seriousness. And so I accepted it, and I repeated it. Oh, man, they go over that, no, I keep it. Dr. Max always brings that up, and so forth and so on. How my poor science and so forth and so on. Well, and why don't they go to my books that I published and read what I have in those books? Now, these bacteria he's talking about, you start with E. coli, what do you end up with? E. coli. You start with a particular kind of a bacterium and you do all this exercises, what do you end up with? Exactly the same bacterium. There's no evolution involved. I know there's some humans can run faster than other humans. There's other humans taller than I am and so forth. I stand next to a fellow who's 6'4". I'd like to know who it was that said all men were created equal. And certainly are these differences, but we're all humans. And that doesn't refute anything at all that I said. Now about this hypermutation. Let's see, we can get that on this hypermutation. Hypermutation is an incredible process, ladies and gentlemen. Somatic hypermutation. They used to say there was junk DNA, and we creationists said there's no such thing as junk DNA. Now they're finding many, many portions of this so-called junk DNA has genes in it, active genes and so forth. It's very, very important. The creationists were right, the evolutionists were wrong. Next slide. Let's see if we can get, all right. Let me get my thing here. I want to talk about hypermutation. Hypermutation in B cells provide evidence for mutation and natural selection. That's what he's claiming. The mutation that takes place in these B cells is totally different than the mutations that occur in our bodies ordinarily. These mutations you and I suffer are caused by chemicals, by radiation and things like that. They're bad, they're horrible, they're awful. Hypermutation is designed to preserve our bodies. It is purposeful. It is designed. Hypermutation takes place only in a highly organized microenvironment of a lymph node called the germinal center. Hypermutation takes place only after it is initiated by contact of an antigen or a T cell with a B cell. Aha, there's a switch. Somebody has to push that switch before it takes place. Only the V region of the antibody in a B cell is affected. Oh, it's more than just the V section in that. What if it caused mutation throughout that entire cell? It would destroy it. Oh, no, it's limited to a very special portion. Only the V region. The mutation rate is 1 million times faster than these mutations that you and I are subject to. Incredible process. Hypermutation requires enhancers, a transcriptional promoter, a variety of special enzymes, and other special molecules are required. And there's some way to select the ones that are good and eliminate the ones that are bad. That system is working there. To compare this elegantly designed system, which immensely enhances the protective process of the immune system, to the purposeless and destructive action of mutations caused by radiation, chemicals, and genetic errors is absolutely absurd. Hypermutation is a fabulous example of irreducible complexity, the origin of which required an intelligent agent. Thank
you. One obvious way to find clues to past life on Earth is to examine the fossil record. Fossils are formed as mud from rivers and lakes and oceans, trap the bodies of dead animals, and preserves their shape as the sediments turn to rock. Recent layers get added on top of older layers as silt keeps building up, so younger fossils are generally found above older ones. Certain fossil species or groups of species are restricted to a certain layer, so those fossils can be used to identify this layer wherever it occurs all over the world. Evolutionists assume that fossils in a particular layer reflect species that were all living at the time that that particular layer was being formed. Now, these layers have often been named according to the localities where they were first discovered, like Mississippian and Devonian. But the important point to remember is that in a given geologic layer, much the same fossil groupings are found throughout the world. Long before Darwin's theory of evolution was conceived, the basic rock layers were characterized according to these groupings of fossil layer species, and the order of these layers, from the older, lower ones to the upper, more recent, was determined. Also, long before Darwin, biologists observed that animals living today can be classified by their anatomy and physiology into the phyla, orders, families, and species that you may have learned about in biology class. This classification scheme can be expressed as a branching tree. For example, the set of multicellular animals has one branch that has a backbone or vertebrae, and this has a branch with 4 limbs, and this has a branch that can reproduce on land, and so forth. Creationists accept this hierarchical classification scheme, which again was established long before Darwin. Now, it's the evolutionist hypothesis that this tree actually represents the genealogic relationship of how these species arose through common descent, with lower branches representing populations that diverged earlier in time. Now, the fact that fossils appear in a sequential order, with older fossils below more recent ones, suggests a testable prediction of the evolution hypothesis. Evolution predicts that the first animals with vertebrae, fishes, must have developed before the 4-limbed vertebrates, amphibians, and that amphibians developed before the first mammals, and so forth. And the order in which these groups evolved, according to evolution, should be reflected in the order in which they appear in the rock layers. The first fish, below the first amphibians, below the first reptiles, and so forth. And it turns out that these predictions of evolutionary hypothesis are all verified by the fossil record. The first fish before the first amphibians, before the first reptiles, and so forth. A more detailed classification of tree makes many more specific predictions, all of which are verified by the fossils. So notice, evolutionary theory explains the hierarchy of animals living today with a hypothesis. evolutionary descent with modification as represented by a very specific genealogic tree. This hypothesis generates a specific prediction about the order of the appearance of the fossils. And when we compare this prediction from hierarchies of modern species to a completely independent set of data, the fossil record, we find complete agreement. When a theory or hypothesis generates a prediction and independent data confirm that prediction, we have found evidence supporting that theory, which can then be published in a professional science journal, allowing the knowledge to be available for other scientists to view and criticize. This, of course, is the way professional science progresses. Now, Dr. Gish says that evolution predicts that paleontologists should have found millions of fossils of transitional species, that is, intermediate forms connecting the major classes of living animals. But according to the ICR, paleontologists haven't found any, thus contradicting the theory of evolution. This argument may persuade non-professional audiences, but it's wrong in both of its parts. First, evolution predicts that transitional forms existed, but to say that evolution requires that this or that specific fossil should have been discovered is misrepresenting the theory. Our fossil record is very scanty, since remains of dead animals are almost always destroyed rather than becoming fossils. An additional point, if one species branched gradually into two, like this, we might expect a large population at the transition, so that even with only rare individuals becoming fossilized, as indicated by these orange marks, some intermediate specimens might be expected. But we now know that evolution most often proceeds rapidly in small populations, as in the case of Darwin's finches, where a few individuals split off from the main population into a new environment with a sudden change in selection pressure, unique to the Galapagos in the case of the finches. In this situation, we would expect the transitional population to be so small that the chance of recovering a fossil specimen would be remote. Such a small transitional population could have existed in a single location on Earth, again like the Darwin's finches, and for a short time period. Here's a diagram showing the geologic layers of Kansas. A transitional species that originated with a particular population in western Kansas in the Carboniferous might have left fossils that we have never seen because they now all lie under a mile of rock. Or if it lived in East Kansas in the Cretaceous, its remains may have eroded away millions of years ago. Therefore, the absence of observed fossil evidence can never indicate that a transitional species did not exist. Furthermore, Dr. Gish is wrong in claiming that no transitional fossils have been found. Many transitions are well documented. Let's consider the transition between humans and the common ancestor of modern apes and humans. The ape and human branches are estimated to have diverged between 5 and 8 million years ago. Many fossil species are known from the human branch, and more are being reported every year. Australopithecus afarensis, whose most famous fossil representative is the 40% complete skeleton known as Lucy, was described in 1976 by Johansen and colleagues. The skeleton has been dated at approximately 3.5 million years old, and similar fossils of several other individuals, apparently belonging to the same species, have been found. Dr. Gish dismisses these fossils as representing Lucy as being just an ape. To see the silliness of this argument, consider how a similar argument might be applied in a hypothetical example in which I try to convince Dr. Gish that tadpoles and frogs are not two different species, but that tadpoles develop into frogs, but I'm limited to only showing photographs of any intermediates. If you look at the photo of a tadpole and an adult frog, it's plain that they are quite different. There's a big gap that Dr. Gish could point to as evidence that they are separate, independently created species. Now, suppose I obtain a photograph from an intermediate time. The tail is smaller than the tadpole, and only short limbs are present. I think I've filled in the gap with an intermediate, but now Dr. Gish sees two gaps. As he sees it, I'm worse off than before. And he says that so-called intermediate is just a frog. A tadpole never has limbs of any size. You just have a frog that happens to have a little bump on its rear end. He could go on claiming that tadpoles and frogs are independent species because he arbitrarily draws a line between what he says is a tadpole and a frog so that he classifies away any real intermediates by saying just a frog or just a tadpole. Or he might say, you claim that tadpoles with 0 legs turn into a frog with 4 legs, so show me an intermediate with 3 legs. Or one like this. Whoops. One like this. Obviously, to be fair, we need to establish reasonable defining criteria for a transitional species before we look at a particular fossil that might represent a transitional. I suggest the following 2 minimal criteria. A transitional species must have lived at a time between its putative precursor and putative descendant, and it must demonstrate a mixture of characters found in the precursor and the descendant species. Lucy's species certainly fits both of these criteria. They lived at the right time, their skulls are ape-like, including a small brain capacity, but their hips and the angle of their knee joints look much more human-like than those of any ape or earlier fossils. In fact, most paleontologists today believe Lucy walked upright similar to us. By these criteria, Lucy represents a transitional species. Dr. Gish says Lucy was just an ape, exactly the counterfeit logic that would allow him to arbitrarily dismiss an intermediate in tadpole development as just a tadpole or just a frog. Dr. Gish also often quotes outdated experts like Solly Zuckerman, who doubted the status of early fragmentary Australopithecus fossils. But Dr. Gish doesn't mention that Zuckerman wrote before the Lucy fossil was described. Or he sometimes mentions arguments between the experts over whether Lucy walked like us or had a more primitive gait. This argument is a smokescreen to cover up the fact that all the experts agree that she lived at the right time, her brain was small like an ape, and the angle of her knee joints resembled modern humans. So regardless of how she walked, she's clearly a transitional fossil. Now, we can't know for sure if her species was actually an ancestor of modern humans, but if not, it was a close cousin to that ancestor. If Dr. Gish had any valid arguments against Lucy's transitional role that could withstand professional scientific scrutiny, he could publish them in a peer-reviewed scientific journal where his ideas might have a chance to influence scientists. But his objections can only persuade non-professionals. His arguments may be fine for back-to-Genesis seminars where no one is inclined to challenge them, but any paleontologist would laugh at them. Another example of a transition nicely documented in the fossil record is the evolution of whales. Scientists comparing whales to other modern mammals had long noticed that whales showed similarities to artiodactyls, the modern group including cows, deer, and sheep. And evolutionists hypothesized that whales evolved from a common ancestor, artiodactyl. Now, since creationists don't have any good arguments against this idea, they like to poke fun of it by imagining a ridiculous hypothetical intermediate. But in fact, several transitional fossils have been found with head and body resembling a whale, but with apparently functional hind limbs, just what you would expect from a transitional species between a land mammal and a whale. And these fossils occur in just the expected layers, more recent than the earliest artiodactyls, but older than any modern type whales. Here is Basilosaurus, which has hind limbs with many bones that are similar to those of typical land mammals, though the limbs would have been too small to support weight on land. Well, how do creationists deal with Basilosaurus? In previous debates, Dr. Gish tried to deny that Basilosaurus was transitional to whales by claiming that this fossil species was a reptile, so it couldn't be transitional from land mammal to whales. But when challenged by the fact that professional science literature uniformly considers Basilosaurus to be a mammal, Dr. Gish could not offer any argument why all the expert paleontologists are wrong and he, a biochemist, is right. Of course, if you make up such ridiculous, phony arguments to discredit every transitional fossil, it's easy to claim that no transitional fossil exists. Now, we don't know for sure whether Basilosaurus was an ancestor of today's whales, shown here in green, it may have been a cousin to that ancestor, and its lineage may have gone extinct, as depicted here in yellow. But this fossil example fulfills an evolutionary prediction of four-footed species resembling whales, and it is just one of a series of fossils, like Ambulocetus, that could be ancestors or cousins of ancestors to modern whales. The ICR creationists seem to discuss a fossil record only to make arguments against evolution. Trained scientists know that in the real world of science, to overturn an accepted theory, you must present evidence in favor of an alternative theory. So if we want to weigh the merits of the creationist view of the fossils, we must focus on their theory and what evidence supports it, something the creationists seem reluctant to do, for good reason. According to Dr. Morris's book, Scientific Creationism, and Dr. Gish's book on the interpretation of fossils, creationists believe that all species originated within a short period through the work of an intelligent creator, and thus all lived at the same time. And the distribution of species in the rock layers can be explained by a great flood, similar to the one described in the biblical story of Noah. In this model, all the sedimentary layers we find in rocks represent materials laid down in the year of the flood. But looking at the fossil record, there is no evidence that supports this model. According to the creation model, at the time life was created, all the modern species we see today, including mammals, birds, and reptiles, were living simultaneously with all the extinct species we know from fossils. But in the lower geologic layers like the Silurian, where we see plenty of fossils of extinct plant and animal species, there are no fossils representing any modern species. None of the 4,000 mammalian species living today, or the 9,000 bird species, or the 6,000 species of reptiles, all of which creationists claim lived together with the extinct species shortly after creation. Now, to get around this massive contradiction to their model, the ICR proposes two hypotheses, neither of which they have ever verified. The first hypothesis is that modern species that are missing from the lower rock layers because as floodwaters rose, intelligent, swiftly moving creatures like man and other mammals could have escaped rising floodwaters by moving to higher ground, whereas slower, stupider creatures like reptiles and amphibians would have drowned earlier and appear in lower levels. This idea might seem reasonable at first glance, but it immediately falls apart under scrutiny. For instance, whale fossils are found together with shark fossils in the upper rock layers, but there are no whales accompanying the shark fossils in the lower levels, which contradicts the creation model, but confirms the evolution model since whales hadn't evolved when those lower layers were laid down. Furthermore, around the world, local floods unfortunately occur in modern times, and plenty of mammals, including humans, drown in them, even though according to the creationists they should have all escaped to higher ground. If there were any real research at the ICR, they might have sent out teams to analyze what actually happens to animals in real floods to test this key hypothesis of their theory. But for the ICR, a hypothesis is not for scientific testing. As long as a hypothesis works in debates and back to Genesis seminars, the ICR has no interest in learning whether it might be false. And let's not forget the modern flowering plants, which are also absent from the lower geologic layers, clearly contradicting the escapee hypothesis, unless the ICR proposes that they escaped rising floodwaters by hiking up mountains like this. Clearly, the ICR's escapee hypothesis is totally inconsistent with the evidence of fossils. The ICR's second excuse to explain why their first hypothesis is contradicted by the fossil record is the so-called principle of hydrodynamic sorting, by which remains of some species are supposed to sink faster than others. Hydrodynamic sorting has a nice ring to it, and debate audiences commonly assume that such a principle has been worked out. But ICR creationists have no principle. In his book, Dr. Morris only mentions hydrodynamic sorting, but offers no detailed theory of sorting that would predict specifically which animals should layer out faster and which slower. So the so-called principle of hydrodynamic sorting makes no predictions. A principle that makes no predictions can have no evidence in favor of it, or against it for that matter. It's simply another vague ad hoc escape clause for the ICR spokesman to mention in debates when it's pointed out that the fossil data massively contradict the ICR model. Furthermore, a completely independent and even simpler argument completely refutes the ICR model that all the fossils were deposited in a single year by the Great Flood. Radiometric dates show that rocks in the lower geologic layers are hundreds of millions of years older than those in the upper layers. ICR creationists try to discredit the accuracy of radiometric dating, but the only way they could explain away this massive contradiction to their theory would be to completely rewrite nuclear physics and geology. This is not just non-professional science, it's anti-science. Apart from fossils, another completely different kind of evidence supports evolution, evidence from homology. Here's a definition of homology. If we look at different modern species and find two similar structures represented by these two triangles, these structures are said to be homologous if it's believed that a common ancestor had a similar structure and all the intermediates also had that structure. The best evidence for homology comes from examining similarities that can't be explained by a design function in common between the structures. For instance, all vertebrate limbs share a similar skeletal structure having a single proximal bone, shown in pink, two distal bones, and topped off by smaller bones. But it's not clear what common design principles could underlie this similarity in limbs with functions as different as swimming, climbing, and flying. The simplest hypothesis to explain these similarities would be that the genes specifying these bones were present in a common ancestor of modern fish, birds, and mammals, and that copies of these genes determine the bone structures in each of the modern species. Modern molecular biology has supported this notion in that many of the same genes have been identified as participating in the development of limbs in chickens, frogs, mice, and humans.